It's often said comparison is the enemy of joy, but for the Edmonton Oilers, it's the key to seeing how close they are to lifting Lord Stanley's Cup.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
To this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my fourth season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've got more than 10 years of experience doing digital hockey content, and I'm so grateful to everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's edition of Locked On Oilers is brought to you by our friends at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money today. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year subscription. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we are going to compare the Edmonton Oilers to the last 5 Stanley Cup champions through a set of criteria. We'll call it effectively a checklist, certain archetype skill sets. We're going to start with an overarching view of what are common themes amongst the last 5 Stanley Cup winners' recent NHL history at large. Our second segment, we will pivot to what those specific archetypes are, what they manifest as, and then in our final segment, we will compare the Oilers to those last 5 Stanley Cup champions. So to start things out, and I do think it's important to frame the conversation in a historical context, because as we all know, we live in the moment because of what's come before. And anybody who tells you the history doesn't matter, the context, trust me, as somebody who meticulously studies history, you start to see recurring patterns. History may not repeat itself, but it does often operate in cycles. And when you start to pick up on recurring trends over and over again, whether we're talking about sports, contemporary politics, culture, whatever, these factors, considerations, they operate on cycles. And right now, the NHL at large is an extremely top-heavy league. What do I mean by that? I'm so glad you asked. That means there's only a handful of teams every year that can win the Stanley Cup. And everydayers have heard me made this comparison a few times. They've heard me make this reference a few times. Bill Belichick, the former coach of the Patriots, now he's the coach at North Carolina, which is going to be an interesting subplot of the college football season this year, by the way. Belichick once said, we have 32 teams in our league. This is nice because the NHL has 32 teams as well now, and we can use the comparison as a one-to-one. We have 32 teams in our league. Before the season even starts, we know 12 of these teams have no chance to even contend, not even make the playoffs. So we're down to 20. Of those 20 teams, about 10 are decent. About 10 can get to the Final Four. And then of those 10, there's really about 5 teams that can win the Stanley Cup. So if we wanted to apply this logic to the NHL last year, all we need to do is look at the NHL standings for 2024, 2025, and sort them by points. So if we're going to take Belichick's principle of 10 teams before we even even get to the playoffs don't have a chance. Last year, that would have been the Sharks, the Blackhawks, the Predators, which were a surprise, the Flyers, the Kraken, the Bruins, which was a surprise, the Sabres, the Ducks, the Penguins, the Islanders, the Rangers, which was a surprise, Detroit, and Utah. Last year, lowest point total of anybody in the Eastern Conference ever in this format, 91 for Montreal and New Jersey, got them both into the postseason. But it takes a convergence of several factors to get teams with that low of point totals in there. And one of the real reasons I like to start the conversation here is there are a lot of teams that, by virtue of their 2, 3, 4 best players, on most nights are going to be able to get by. They're going to be able to out-talent, for lack of a better word, their opposition. For example, most of the time, you drop Connor, Leon, and our Oilers against that mushy middle, from anybody from 15 down, anybody from, say, the Senators through the Sharks in the standings from last year against the Oilers. The Oilers, by virtue of their star power, by virtue of McDavid, Draisaitl, Evan Bouchard, and their power play, even though it was a little bit worse last year than the year before, top 15 power play is more than enough to make a difference because that's where your stars really shine. And That is one of the real consistent keys to being a consistent playoff team. And we'll get to what specific archetype of player you're going to be looking for when we're talking about this checklist at large in our next segment. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. But think about it in terms of recent NHL history. We'll start about 2010 or so because that's where our salary cap starts to become workable for comparison's sake. You have the Bruins who win the Stanley Cup final in 2011. They get back there one more time in 2019 against the Blues. The Kings, they win the Stanley Cup the following year. They get back there 2 years later. The Blackhawks, who win in 2010, win in 2013, win in 2015 against the Lightning, who gets to the final in 20 and 21. 2014, the Kings, who had won in 2012. 2016, the Penguins. 2017, the Penguins. Consistent playoff team for a while. Outlier, 2018. The Washington Capitals, who make the playoffs a bunch of times, have yet to make it to a conference final since then and didn't previously in the Ovechkin era. Extreme outlier, St. Louis Blues. That is the one that every single NHL organization looks at and says, look, all we got to do is get in, and that could be us. The Blues are the most extreme of extreme outliers. Major upset in the Stanley Cup final against a significantly more talented Bruins team. Of course, that's why they play the games. Talent does not determine everything. 20 and 21, the Lightning, who had been to the Stanley Cup final and been to a couple conference finals. 22, Avalanche, they had been to a couple conference finals, finally break through. Golden Knights, been to a conference final, been to a Stanley Cup final, they break through. Florida, been to a Stanley Cup final, broke through. Florida, Stanley Cup final, broke through. What all of those teams have in common? Superstars. An abundance of superstars. And look, the Oilers, they got that covered. The Oilers have the superstar quota covered at the high end of their roster. The problem for the Oilers, and something that I think is going to come more into focus in our next segment, and I don't want to get ahead of myself again. I'll tease it a little more, but when you think about these teams, something that becomes an issue, and part of the reason the majority of them, other than I would say Vegas and Florida, the struggle to maintain a quality roster over an extended period of time is extremely real. Your depth guys become other people's fringe stars. They become other teams' fringe first line players. You think about it. We'll use Tampa Bay because they have 2 cups in this period of time. They traded Blake Coleman for Barclay Goodrow. They had guys like Anthony Cirelli in the pipeline. They had guys like Ross Colton in the pipeline. They developed Kucherov. They developed Braden Point. They developed Anthony Cirelli. You have Steven Stamkos as a holdover from the last window of contention. You have Hedman. You trade for Ryan McDonough. You trade JT Miller and turn him into draft picks. You get Mikhail Sergachev for Jonathan Drouin. Tampa Bay is a meticulous long-term process. And then look what happens after they win. You have to trade Sergachev. Killorn and Palat, free agents, they leave. You have to consistently find ways to reinvent yourself. And that's where the Oilers are now. They are dealing with the repercussions of sustained success without ever breaking through that ceiling. And there are a handful of teams that come to mind in a similar vein. The Bruins, I think, fit this box very well. I think the Rangers, to an extent, fit this box very well. Team that has really good high-end players. I mean, as much as I make fun of the Bruins, they still have Pasta, they still got McAvoy, they still got Swayman. That is plenty of talent on a night-to-night basis. Their depth is non-existent. The Rangers, JT Miller, Panarin, Fox, Shesterkin, that is more than enough high-end talent to be considered a playoff team. But the differentiation point, the longer you go in the playoffs, comes down to depth. And coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down what exactly we mean by quality depth and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. College football is back, and honestly, there is nothing better than the energy of a tailgate, standing around, cutting it up with the guys. The only downside, trying to get tickets, endless queues, hidden fees, and prices that jump at checkout. That's why the only app I use to buy tickets is Game Time, the app that gives advantage back to the fans. It's the easiest way to score last-minute tickets at the best prices with no surprise fees. What you see is what you hey, my friends and I have our eye on a couple of different college football games in the greater Northeast. We're planning on going to the whiteout at Penn State. Penn State goes to Rutgers this year. Oregon goes to Rutgers this year. So my friends and I are definitely keeping an eye on prices there. The app makes it so easy. You can even see the exact view from your seats before you buy. And they have a little feature called Zone Deals, where you pick the section and Game Time will find the best deal in that section. It's faster and it's cheaper than any other way to get to the game. So take the guesswork out of buying college football tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first survey. Terms apply. Again, that is code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket. Download Game Time today. We here at Locked On have an important request. We want to hear from you. We've put together a survey to learn more about our listeners and make your podcasts even better. This is your chance to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and answer questions about advertising. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey to get started. Everyone who completes the survey will be entered for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Amazon gift cards. Again, that's lockedonpodcast.com/survey. You can also find the link in the show notes. Thank you so much for helping Locked On out. So, my friends, as part of this checklist process, we have to find recurring themes. We have to find recurring skill sets because in the NHL, in hockey, I should say, we have yet to reach maximum efficiency. We're not like the NFL. We're not like the NBA. We're not like baseball. There's no one way to play. There's no one way to build a team. And I think that lack of homogeny makes it interesting. I think that lack of homogeny makes more people feel like their team has a chance, even if they don't look exactly like a contender does. And in the context of the Florida Panthers roster and dominance over the last 24 months, I do think it's worth evaluating them against the greater perspective of the last 5 to 10 years. So what's the one recurring theme amongst all the teams we talked about in our last segment, from the Blackhawks in 2010 all the way to this past June's Florida Panthers? The number one single most recurring answer is multiple superstar forwards. Taves, Kane, Ovechkin, Backstrom, Crosby, Malkin, Stamkos, Kucherov, Point. Tampa Bay had 3. Barkov, Kachuk, Eichel, Stone, McKinnon, Rantanen, Landeskog. It is unequivocal. Again, the Blues, an outlier. I don't know who I would say was their second best forward after Ryan O'Reilly. I would have to do some circumstantial looking, and frankly, they're an outlier. We can put them in a separate box. But the Oilers have that. And we'll talk more about what the Oilers do and don't have against our checklist in our next segment. But the Oilers got McDavid Draisaitl covered. That solves quite a lot of issues. But once you start going further and further down the list, you start getting to other things. The 2 superstar forwards is unequivocal. I think there's an argument to be made that that's the reason the Rangers never broke through, whether you want to talk about that iteration with Henrik Lundqvist or the one over the last couple of years with Shesterkin, where Panarin, undoubtedly a superstar, but no second player. I could argue that you even need to be a tier higher than what Panarin is, and Panarin's been one of the best players in the NHL since getting there. So I have that archetype as franchise player forward, because not to be confused, and as we talk about a lot here, the everydayers have heard me say it, the best forward is always going to be more valuable than the best defenseman. So yes, if you have the choice between Connor McDavid and Quinn Hughes, you should take Connor McDavid. That brings us to our second point on our checklist. Elite number 1 defenseman. Now, these are recurring as well. With the Blackhawks, Duncan Keith, Drew Doughty. With the Lightning, Victor Hedman. The Panthers, Forsling fits the checklist box, but his counting stats don't get to the threshold of most of these other 1Ds, even if you want to go to like Pietrangelo or John Carlson. Hedman, one of the best of his era, unequivocally. Duncan Keith, one of the best of his era. Chris Letang, I think, is probably closer to what Forsling is than what we had just said about maybe Victor Hedman, Duncan Keith, Drew Doughty. I think Chris Letang will probably end up in the Hockey Hall of Fame at some point, even though I'm not necessarily overwhelmingly impressed with his resume, even though he's a very good hockey player, obviously, for debating the merits of the Hall of Fame. And I think this is one of the first real inflection points in talking about the Oilers, because I think Evan Bouchard is good enough. I really genuinely do. I think he is capable of being one of the 10 to 15 best defensemen in the NHL. Frankly, I think he already is one of the best 10 to at worst 15 defensemen in the NHL. That puts him in a good position. So you have your two franchise forwards. You have your number one elite defenseman, though not franchise. Franchise, I would say Hedman, Makar, Duncan Keith, those are franchise caliber defensemen in the context of their era. Obviously, Duncan Keith not putting up the counting stats of, say, a Bouchard, a Makar, a Quinn Hughes, because the way the NHL has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. The next key point, elite defensive forward. It helps when you have guys like Barkov, who are both. It helps when you have guys like Reinhart, who aren't just elite at defense, but can also contribute offense. You look at guys like Arturi Lehkonen, Valeri Nichushkin for Colorado a couple years ago. You talk about guys like Anthony Cirelli, Blake Coleman, Yanni Gourde for Tampa Bay, Vegas, Chandler Stevenson, Ivan Barbashev, Mark Stone comes to mind as well. Chicago. I don't think it's as direct a one-to-one because Chicago's defense was so much deeper that they didn't necessarily need that elite defensive guy. Jonathan Toews, of course, one of the better defensive centers of his era, somebody who won a Selke Trophy in that pocket of undisputed Bergeron dominance. Anze Kopitar, of course, elite defensive player, but that helps. When your elite defensive guys are also capable of putting up counting stats, that helps so much. But you do need those types of guys. And why do I say that? Those are the guys who play the game in a way that puts you in an advantageous game state. Even if we're talking about, Blake Coleman, Yanni Gourde, Valeri Nichushkin, Arturi Lehkonen, Chandler Stevenson, Ivan Barbashev. None of those guys on an individual talent basis can do what Sam Reinhart can. They can't do what Toews could, what Bergeron. But those guys play strong two-way hockey. They get the puck in deep, they cycle the puck, and they play offense. And they are not on defense. That is where your quality depth shines through. And that is an integral part. And I say this all the time. Everydayers have heard me say this for years. When you get to a conference final, a Stanley Cup final, more likely than not, the other team's first two lines are going to cancel yours out. Now, they may not be matched up directly head to head, but the goal distribution throughout the course of the lineup is going to be relatively evenly. Of course, both teams are going to do their best to have their top six avoid the other team's top six to try and get that more of a punching down. You want to get McDavid out there against the other team's third or fourth line because he has a better chance of exploiting that, winning that matchup by more, and that's more valuable. And when you have those two groups playing to a push, that's where your depth comes out. That's what matters. And look, we are operating in a top-heavy NHL. The Tampa Bay teams, the Florida team, two of the most talented groups in the history of the salary cap era. The Chicago teams with all the guys who trickle out because of the salary cap. The Penguins who had all their depth trickle out over the course of the years following their wins and because of the salary cap. It is unequivocal that you need those stars at the top. You need that high-end number one defenseman at worst. It can't be anything lower than that. I think Evan Bouchard is good enough, but you need somebody who's going to play at least one of your special teams, if not both, somebody who is capable of putting up 50 to 80 points, counting stats-wise, while being a quality defensive player. And look, Bouchard's not elite defensively, but he's not bad. He's more than capable of playing decent defense. Then you start getting down the checklist. Do you have a matchup defenseman? Do you have, your Ryan McDonough? Do you have your Braden McNabb? Do you have in the case of Florida, I would probably say that Seth Jones and Nico Mikkola, I would say that Aaron Ekblad and Gus Forsling pair. Do you have guys who can go out there, tread water in disadvantageous defensive positions and put your team in a position where you can survive those difficult minutes? We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we return, we're going to go down the checklist of what the Oilers have and, more importantly, what they don't have. Be right back. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers, to everybody who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Greatly appreciated. I understand the responsibility I have if I'm the first bit of content you are interacting with in the morning to set the tone for your day. Believe me, I appreciate it more than you know. So, in talking about the Oilers in the context of where they want to go, we are in a cup or bust window. And look, I have spent a ton of time this summer addressing what that means. You know, can we find joy in seasons that don't culminate in a championship? What can we learn? How can we grow? And how do we have that perspective? Because even if the expectation is to win the whole thing, the season can't be a failure if you don't. So with that in mind, we are going to do our comparisons. We are going to try and bridge the gap with the teams we think that are better on paper. And the recurring archetypes you come back to over and over again. The franchise caliber forward is unequivocal. Florida, they have at least two. You can make an argument Sam Reinhart is three. When you talk about the Golden Knights, Jack Eichel meets the criteria there for franchise forward. I would say when Mark Stone is healthy, he's that player, but he hasn't been that consistently healthy. But lo and behold, they have Mitch Marner now, so like they have two again. Colorado right now, I think, has 1.5. I don't think Marty Necas is that caliber of player. I think he's very good. I think Necas is a star forward. I think his combination of size and skating makes him one of the really tantalizing ideas in the league, and somebody who I think, frankly, has another level to get to. But right now, you know, no more Rantanen. Landeskog coming off of that injury. Look, he looked good in the playoffs, but I need to see more, obviously, before I can make a determination as to whether or not he meets that threshold. I don't think he did, even when they won the Cup. I would venture to say Nazem Kadri, frankly, was a better player that season for Colorado, at least in the regular season, where he was almost a point per game, if not more, if I remember correctly. And then you start getting into the weeds. And the Oilers right now desperately need quality depth. They need their Blake Coleman, their Yanni Gourde, their Andre Palat, their Alex Killorn, their Chandler Stevenson, their Ivan Barbashev, their Anton Lundell, their Esto Luosterainen, their Teuvo Teravainen, their Nick Bonino, their Carl Hagelin. That is the area the Oilers are most sorely lacking right now. I think the Oilers have one or two guys who have the capacity that if it pans out for them, say Trent Frederick, maybe Ike Howard, could fill some of those voids. And look, it is easier to get depth than it is star power. Make no mistake about it. Part of the reason the same teams win consistently is because stars don't change teams all that often. Before Mitch Marner, it had been a little while since we had a genuine bona fide superstar move. Like Jake Gensel, I think, is a really good player. I don't know if I would put him in that superstar caliber tier. I think he's right on that cut line. I think I had him at like 40, maybe 35. In the NHL 100 for what Locked On is working on. But that, for me, is the Oilers' biggest need right now. Because I think Zach Hyman, on his best day, is quality depth. I think he can unequivocally be that Carter Verhaeghe type player. I think he can be Jonathan Marchessault if we're talking about the Vegas group. I don't think he can get to that Sam Reinhart level. He doesn't need to, but I think if we're talking about where the Oilers can bridge the gap, they need more quality depth. I think being stuck to some degree with a fading star like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is a little bit tough because you don't want to put him in an awkward situation where he's a third line center. You want to maximize him because you know there's still skill there. You know, you see the flashes, you see the glimmers of a really quality puck mover distributor, but the Oilers lack the depth. And look, they are taking swings. I think Andrew Mangiapane can be a Blake Coleman facsimile. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I don't think Vasily Podkolzin can be Alex Killorn or Andre Palat. I don't think he can be an Esto Luosterainen or a Brad Marchand. And that's the issue here. As good as these guys can be, and look, I think there's a lot to be gained from some of these pieces like Mangiapane, like Ike Howard, like Matthew Savoie, like Trent Frederick. I don't think those guys, even at their best, are going to get the Oilers to close the gap. And that's really the trick here. The more room for error, I should say, you have, the better your chances are of realizing your potential. The more you need to go right, the more difficult it is, the more variables you introduce, if, because each of those becomes a multiplying factor for the unlikeliness of it coming together. So for example, let's say the Oilers are playing a hockey game and it's tied 3-3. More likely than not, they're going to go out there with McDavid, Draisaitl, and Hyman, Ekholm, Bouchard, and keep rolling that group out there to try and win the game. What does that do to the rest of the lineup? It puts more responsibility on the other 9 forwards to not make mistakes, because they know if they go down a goal, they're going to have to ride those top guys even harder. This is the comparison I like to make, and this is the lens I view roster construction through. If everything goes as it's planned, what does that look like? So in that case, that's McDavid, Draisaitl, and Hyman contributing to offense, scoring goals, putting the puck in the net. What does that mean for everyone else? It means not losing the game. It means playing it safe. It means trying to bring the tempo and the temperature of the game down and trying to buy offensive zone time, to work the cycle, to get the puck high to low. The Oilers have guys who can do that, but they don't have guys who have the upside of some of the teams they're going to come across, especially when it comes to their bottom 6. And look, when you have McDavid and Draisaitl, that solves so many issues. But when you are talking about a team that has massive question marks in the depth portion of their lineup, the bottom defensive pair, I would say I have questions, not massive. And then in net, which we haven't talked about really at all in this final segment, the worst goalie you can win the Stanley Cup with is somewhere between 10 and 15. I think Adin Hill, I think Jordan Binnington, I think Darcy Kemper have all flirted at various points with being top 10 goalies, but I don't think they've ever been consistent top 10 goalies. Even Binnington, who as the goalie for Team Canada, the leader in the clubhouse for the Olympic team next year, I don't think Jordan Binnington is a top 10 goalie in the league consistently. He's been one a few times, but he's had some really bad seasons in there as well. Adin Hill is somebody who has played relatively well, but has injury issues, has workload issues. I think Darcy Kemper, you saw the high-end version of that in LA this past year. I think you saw the low-end version of it in Washington the year before, where he lost the job to Charlie Lindgren. I think when you're talking about goalies that can win the Stanley Cup, you got to play for ceiling. And I think, unfortunately for the Oilers, they saw the ceiling of Stuart Skinner, where he won the 40 games as a rookie, and said, okay, that's good enough. That'll play. And he hasn't really found that form again since, for an extended period of time. For games here and there, for series here and there, sure. But with that as a major liability, with their bottom 6 of their forward group a major liability, with the Darnell Nurse question mark lingering around this group, it is hard to see how they close the gap to a team like Florida. I think when you have guys like McDavid and Draisaitl that are so capable of elevating what's around them, that solves a lot of issues. But I do think that it has warped some of the Oilers' perceptions of their own roster. I don't think Adam Henrique's a third-line center anymore. I don't feel particularly confident Andrew Mangiapane is going to be a good first-line left wing. I don't think I'm going to be banking on Vasily Podkolzin, Ike Howard, or Matthew Savoie to be significant goal contributors this upcoming season. The Oilers are leaving a lot to chance. When you have stars like McDavid, Draisaitl, Bouchard, that affords you leeway. How much leeway? We will find out this season. Thank you to everybody who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, where we've got your Oilers covered every single day. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please throw the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get notifications whenever new content goes live. Let me know where you think the Oilers are at on their checklist of needs if they're going to win the Stanley Cup. Be sure to check out that Locked On survey for a chance at one of those Amazon gift cards. And be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night, where they are previewing all 32 teams ahead of the 2025-2026 NHL season. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.